Welcome to the Bicurian podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is Bicurian, you ask?
Well, you may not necessarily have a mental concept of Bicurian, partially maybe because it's a made-up word. You embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the Bicurian moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the Bicurian.
Welcome to the show. This is Eric.
And I am Aisla.
And for this episode, we wanted to revisit one of our shows we did last year, almost exactly a year ago, around the FOSTA and SESTA laws.
Right. And we are very excited that this time we have a guest, Bennet Kelley, founder of the Internet Law Center, who is very well versed in this topic. So you get to have more information. Hello, Bennet. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Do you want me to tell you a little bit about myself?
Yeah, that'd be great. Can you share a little bit more about you?
As you mentioned, I am the founder of the Internet Law Center, founded in 2007. And we're based in Santa Monica. We're a full-service Internet law firm. And my practice focuses mainly on representing e-commerce clients in one vertical and compliance and a whole host of other areas, and representing victims of cyber harassment. So it's kind of the dark side of the web. I've also, for 8 years, I've had a podcast, Cyber Law and Business Report. And in addition, I write and blog on a variety of things.
Yeah, everything we've read from you has been amazing. We'll post some links up for our listeners to check it out in more detail. But so for this show, we kind of wanted to talk about what does FOSTA and SESTA look like now? Like, what have been the ramifications?
Sure. So I guess just give a quick,
let's recap in case.
Yeah, in our last episode. Marge and Blanche. So in our last episode, we had, just for those who aren't familiar, in Congress passed in the Communications Decency Act in the 90s. And it has a key provision called Section 230, which says that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So in English, what that means is if you're a website and you create a forum for people to have discussions, you're not liable for that content. The individual themselves are liable for that content. And so that created immunity for a whole bunch of sites for some of the more controversial sites such as Ripoff Report, and even just immunity for the debates you have on Facebook, and it was viewed as kind of almost like the Magna Carta of the internet, because it just allowed this expansion of internet forums, and but everything has downsides to it, and one of the downsides was people were becoming concerned about some proliferation of basically online prostitution ads, and its role actually in facilitating sex trafficking. And one of the leading sites in that area was a site called Backpage, which became very controversial, became the focus of a Senate investigation, and also was indicted in California and Texas. And there were efforts really just to basically shut down Backpage. And so it is in that context that you have the FOSTA and SESTA bills, which were designed to create an amendment to Section 230 for basically facilitating sex trafficking, but it was written in a way that's quite broadly, and that now we have, a year later, we're seeing some of the fallout from that, because well, first of all, Backpage was shut down by the feds under existing law, not because of FOSTA.
Yeah, we were prepping, and you mentioned that, and I didn't realize that actually had happened.
Yeah.
Parallel and not related to.
Yeah. So basically, if 5 days before FOSTA was signed, Backpage was shut down. But by that point, there was so much momentum behind the bill. It's an election year, and Ivanka Trump is on board. So, the president just was no way he was going to turn back at that point. And so the law has been in effect now a year, almost a year, and so we're trying to figure out what has happened, and there have been some negative fallouts that we can go through.
Yeah. So, and I think another thing when we were kind of just talking right before we got on the show here that you mentioned was some of this law, it turns out, was probably motivated by these tech companies trying to give a little bit because they had gotten a lot of negative press around the 2016 elections and, in ways in which their platforms were abused by, Russians or whoever. But realistically, I mean, it makes sense that they would try to give a little to save some face.
But this law doesn't in any way affect those acts. This is primarily intended to counter
I think it was just
sexual content.
It was just an exchange, right? Yeah. Like, we'll give you a little bit of this, you let us off the hook on that.
And so just to expand on that point, you're very right. The both of you actually. But Section 230 is kind of from the tech lobby is considered the third rail. You just don't touch it. And so anytime you try to go there, there's a very spirited defense of Section 230, and it's usually great unison among the tech community to not to allow any amendment to that. And that was the case here for the longest time. One of the big tech lobbies, the Internet Association, which has Facebook and Google as members, was leading the fight to push back on this bill. And but keep in mind, you also have an election year. And, who in an election year wants to have a vote that encourages, and that's arguably encourages, I mean, you can figure out what the ad's going to say. You voted with that deep voice. You voted for a bill to allow online prostitution. I mean, no one wants to be in that position. So, they had a difficult challenge to begin with. But then once Google and Facebook really started getting hit hard on Capitol Hill for their role in the 2016 election, and then Cambridge Analytica came out, Facebook executives basically pulled the rug out from under their lobbying team and said, we're going to give in on FOSTA. Let's throw them this bone. Let's see if that'll get them to back off. And so it just changed dynamic. You have the Internet Association being all rah-rah, in the fight against it, to, okay, yeah, well, we reached a compromise.
Huh.
And, we basically, and you can see, someone lying under the bus.
Yeah.
That's what had happened.
Well, that's why I wanted to share this too, because I mean, that's a lot of insight into this. I mean, when we originally did our show on it, we were approaching it from the fact that we have contacts that are sex workers that were lobbying on their own, not even for legalization, but at least for decriminalization. And this really just chased it all onto the dark web. I think that's the kind of the first fallout that we knew was going to happen.
Yeah, they were talking about just the danger. Like, many of them were talking about, there's a class of prostitution or sex workers who are well off enough that it wasn't going to really affect them in a significantly big way. But then there was a larger group of folks who were really looking at this as putting them into very dangerous situations and then they really didn't know what was going to happen. Losing those, I guess there were some websites where they could meet up and discuss safety issues and, known people who were
like not actually involving in actual sex work and prostitution, but actually just resource centers that they can no longer access.
Yeah, they can talk about clients.
Or what's
anything.
happened is some of them just moved on shore. And actually, one of those sites, a site called Slixa, had a essay competition on what FOSTA has meant to us, for sex workers. And I sent you a link to one of the winners.
Yeah, we'll definitely post that.
And so a whole bunch of people talked about, well, what this had done to them as sex workers. And, and some of the sex workers were, I guess, to use lack of a better word, dabblers. They had other professions, but they used this to supplement their income or for other reasons. And so that's, this basically has prevented that. But in terms of some of the negative or, the unintended consequences of FOSTA, one is, yes, it is sent prostitution back on the street.
Yeah.
Which, and I grew up in a bad neighborhood, and it's hard to explain the impact of having, prostitutes on your street, on what that does to a neighborhood in terms of, not just its value in a real estate sense, but also to its psyche. It just, you don't feel like you're in a safe community. And so that it was one problem. Another problem is that, and also by sending sex workers to the street, it's more dangerous for them. In addition, it's also, as I said, sent a lot of it just offline. So it really hasn't had a big impact in that respect. But it's also made it harder for law enforcement to monitor sex trafficking. As bad as Backpage was and some of the other websites, at least cops could monitor and get a sense of what was going on and where sex trafficking was occurring. And now they now they have to push to other sites of the dark web, and they can't do that as well.
That was actually one of our points too, was, for better or worse, you could, as law enforcement or really anyone, get on and kind of get a feel for what was going on in your community.
Well, that was the fear, right? But it sounds like that's actually what happened, that the law enforcement didn't have the same access to monitor.
The dark web, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a quote I have here in front of me that is a report from Fox News in Oklahoma that Backpage was one of the biggest tools for the Tulsa Police Vice Unit to find victims of sex trafficking and those who were trafficking victims. Police said now they can't set up stings on Backpage. They've been able to focus their manpower on investigating reports of prostitutions at massage parlors. In other words, the Backpage shutdown has diverted law enforcement resources from protecting sex trafficking victims and pursuing prostitution more generally.
Yeah. So it's a kind of the opposite effect of the point of the bill.
Yeah. And as I said, the main point of the bill was Backpage. And I know some of the people who testified against them, and one of them is a law professor, Eric Goldman, who's very passionate about this topic. And one of his main points was, you don't need this law. You can shut down Backpage using existing law. And in fact, they're under investigation. And as I mentioned, before the bill was signed, it was shut down, proving his point.
So what other, and I mean, the law enforcement thing I think is perfectly valid, but what other kind of unintended consequences have you noticed in the last several months?
Well, one other is that it's led to increased kind of self-censorship. Websites don't want to have sexual content of any sort. And, Facebook is cracking down on any content that seems to be lewd. You have, blanking on the name all of a sudden, Tumblr, that decided to take down all, pornographic or, semi-pornographic images from its website. You have Craigslist eliminating personal ads, since some of the prostitution ads were really disguised as personal ads.
Right.
And, it's caused a chilling effect. And so the whole point of CDA 230 was to expand discussion and have robust forums. This amendment has done quite the opposite. It's had a chilling effect in discussions in certain areas.
Do you think there's
the
any
other effect that we haven't seen yet, but is around the corner, is the invitation to do this again? In that, to the extent we've amended Section 230 in this substantive way, well, maybe there's something else we can carve out. And ironically, one of the more troubling things in the whole FOSTA debate, Senator Ron Wyden, who was one of the original sponsors of CDA 230, actually had a warning, and he called CDA 230 a success, but he said with one glaring exception, and he and that exception is it's the social media's inability to combat hate speech. And he said failure by companies to properly understand the premise of the law is the beginning of the end of the protections it provides. And I say that because of their failures are making it increasingly difficult for me to protect 230 in Congress. And so there are other areas, I think, where people would like to make exceptions to 230. And to the extent that social media or the other platforms don't regulate themselves in a way so that you're seeing abuses. I don't know if you saw the recent ADL study about the number of people who are being seriously harassed on the web or subject to hate speech.
There's certainly been in the news.
Problems out there.
Yeah.
And of course, although people would say, hey, that's the First Amendment, and that's an argument too. But one of the lingering effects of FOSTA will be what's the next FOSTA.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I think one of the big concerns I have is it's the law erosion thing.
Right.
It's always easy to sit there and say, if you're on the side of like being anti-alt-right hate speech and all of that, like, oh yeah, amend it. Let's just make that so that if your website has that, it can be blocked. But that becomes this slippery slope, because the next time somebody else is in power, suddenly something that you're passionate about is also getting blocked.
Exactly.
And realistically, these laws are designed to kind of keep it an even playing field. And the minute we're going tit for tat on that, I mean, that's a big problem.
Probably not the best phrase to use in this context, but
well, and I think also the Wild West of the internet. I was an early adopter, and it's changed a lot since 1992.
True.
And there is something about like a personal accountability piece that when it was a little bit harder to access, you had to put in enough effort. Not that there weren't obviously harassment issues and things, but it was
right.
It was a lot more expected. Like I got on forums in 1998 and had conversations with people, and they were in depth and civil exchanges around controversial topics. And then 10 years later, I got on to a forum and introduced what I thought was a pretty benign topic and got piled on. And I was like, what just happened?
Right.
And in that 10 years, the expansion of participation didn't come with, I don't know, some kind of onboarding process. So I feel like there was an accountability piece that changed, I
think, one, it's become mechanized. And I also think it's been, trolling has become an occupation for some.
Yeah.
I have my own trolls.
Yeah.
But it's been especially bad for women. I remember there was a cover story, I think, in a magazine called Pacific Standard as to why does the internet hate women? And Twitter just did a study last year on toxic Twitter. How Twitter is especially dangerous for women, particularly women journalists. And it is a problem. And there are actually it's an Amnesty International who's leading the toxic Twitter study. And they had quotes from Twitter executives said that, we suck at this in terms, seriously, there's actually, you would think that a CEO, a high-ranking officer of a company wouldn't openly say in an interview that we suck at something, but he did. And it's startling.
Well, so this brings up something from your intro that I found intriguing, and maybe you can go into this a little bit more, but you mentioned that you represent people that are victims of harassment. What does that look like? I mean, it's just an average. What does that look like? Just an average kind of a case or whatever. Like what is a victim of an internet harassment experiencing, and what's being done? It
can be revenge porn. It can be a stalker. It can be a coworker. One of the first cases I had was someone was put on the website Dating Psychos, which, just to be clear, is not a place to find a date. And and posted all these awful things about her. Said she had herpes and all this other things, and tried to kill a guy. Laughed when she found out he had herpes, and it turned out to be a coworker.
Wow.
And this woman wasn't even dating, and just someone wanted to screw with her and put something up there. And I think there was a recent, I don't know if it was New York Times or some profile about some woman who posted something on Twitter or some random forum that offended someone somewhere in the heartland of America that she had no knowledge of. And that person just went on a rampage against her and started ruining her online reputation.
Is that like libel, or do those laws apply to that kind of thing?
So it can be.
Okay.
And so that's some of the challenge. I can go on and say, I think you're awful. I think this. I think, as long as you're expressing opinion, you're usually protected. Although, sometimes is that if to the extent that opinion implies a fact. But a lot of these nutcases have no money. The proverbial, the 400-pound kid sitting in his basement that Trump always refers to. I mean, they exist in real life to a certain degree, and so what do you do? What is the benefit of going after them? And so sometimes the law can help, particularly in revenge porn. You can get stuff taken down and get some compensation. There's some statutory damages, but often. There's the cases, and I actually had a discussion with a judge. I had a new case, and I was before her for the first time, and she said, does this ever go anywhere? And I said, well, sometimes. But sometimes you find out that it's someone who either doesn't have the money, or they're often, I remember I had one case with a guy that spent 80% of the year in international waters. And so how are you going to serve them? And how are you going to execute the judgment on them? So there are challenges to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes sense. But I mean, like the reason that I actually kind of wanted to bring that up to the point of the show topic today is that, these are legitimate things, and we're talking about the erosion of 230 and the things that people could do, like because it's easy to say that, we'd like to block alt-right hate speech from being on there. And if your site is hosting harassment, you're liable for the harassment and things. There's a lot of ways in which the FOSTA SESTA has set up these sorts of things, and it's like feel-good legislation, right? Because it feels great to do that, but I really think that...
Well, there was, that First Amendment thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That pesky little First Amendment.
There's an academic, Daniel Citron, University of Maryland, although maybe she just switched to Boston U, who said that the failure or the slowness to respond to online harassment is actually gender discrimination, since women are mostly the targets. Mm-hmm. And our failure to prioritize that stems from, kind of, and whether it's intentional or not, a less prioritizing of harms to women.
It makes sense.
And I think there's a certain basis for it. Having represented victims of revenge porn, luckily, former Attorney General Kamala Harris, she actually became a champion of that issue. And she published a bulletin for law enforcement to say, hey, dudes, this is serious. Here's the crimes that, here's the laws it violates. Please take this seriously. And every time I have a victim talk to me and I tell them to report this to the police, I say, please print out that circular. This is, from a high up state authority saying this matters. This is serious. Because a lot of times people just don't take it seriously. And I've had people say that. And one woman said, what should I do? She lived in a town, and the cop actually said, we don't do internet stuff. Yeah. And she said, what should I do? I said, move. I mean, vote with your feet, or get whoever's in charge, kicked out.
Yeah.
But it is frustrating in that extent.
Well, this is the disruptive world we live in. I mean, the last 20 years has been massively shifting with technology and how we interact with it. And nobody really knows what to do with it. That's just the reality. And
we need some new cultural norms, honestly. Like
right. Like why would any jurisdiction say that just because you're getting harassed on the internet it doesn't count as harassment. If they called your landline, it'd be harassment. If they put it online, it's not.
I gave a presentation at my alma mater. I went to Georgetown Law, and basketball is big, or used to be big there. They're kind of recovering, but the coach was Coach Thompson at the time, and I said, "Here's the irony. I can go to his house, which is only so many miles from here, and I can spray paint on his garage that he is a rapist, a murderer, whatever it is you want to put, and I'll be arrested for damaging his property. If I go on the web and blast that all over the place, and in essence damaging his most valuable property, his reputation, I'm scot-free."
Yeah, I mean, that's, and again, that's one of those areas where I think laws and legislation around that sort of thing are going to have to happen in that adding a line of text that phone calls, internet harassment all count as harassment, like just add in internet to it.
And you're starting to see it. I don't know if you followed at all. There was that controversial case that was just decided by the Massachusetts Supreme Court. There was the high school girl who egged on her boyfriend to commit suicide.
Yeah, I saw that. And she lost her appeal.
And so you're starting to see norms where outrageous behavior on the internet is being recognized as criminal.
So, and that's first steps, right? Because that's really just precedent, right? That's what we're talking about here, is that a court will look at what another court decided and precedent's been set that it's that way. But these aren't actually laws yet. Like, you're relying on your circuit court, to do the right thing based on what another court did. And,
well, in this case, it was the Massachusetts Supreme Court, so that means that's the law of the land in Massachusetts.
Right.
And basically, it said it was, I think, manslaughter or something like that, second-degree homicide, because what happened was the victim, was seriously depressed and had decided to, and each time had made a number of attempts and always decided, no, I'm not going to do it. And so this time, he was gassing himself in his car. And he stepped out and he called her and she told him to get back in the car.
Right.
So, it was her dealing with someone who was under duress, forcing him to go back in and complete the transaction, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so, because it's always the causal element in suicide. Like, well, you didn't pull the trigger. But in essence, they found that she more or less did in this case.
Was culpable in it, yeah. Yep. I don't know. I mean, for me, I feel like there does need to be some legislation and laws around that sort of thing, but I think it's more of a protective thing, less of what FOSTA and SESTA did, which is sort of blanket, chase things away, and really wasn't protecting the personal freedoms of anybody.
I think it's troubling, and you have to tread lightly because we're talking about speech. And you don't want to be abused. And I actually looked at, it was a time around the turn of the century, the last one, not this one, where most states had criminal defamation laws.
Yeah.
And I saw a law review article, and a lot of those cases, where it was applied, it was to go after political opponents. And so you don't necessarily want that as a tool to allow people basically to criminalize political speech. But what we're seeing on the internet is some of these defamation mills, the various cheater sites or revenge porn sites, where these sites are basically set, their sole purpose is to injure someone.
Right. So it's more of a personal violation at that point.
Yeah, and so the law needs to adapt, and granted, in revenge porn, the law has adapted. It's illegal in like all but 10 states, and so that's a concern. But when you're dealing with speech, people say, well, it's just the internet and blah blah blah. But I've talked to victims. Some people's lives are being ruined. They're just emotionally devastated by it, and there has to be a better judges. And part of the problem is even if you have a law, you have judges. I've had cases where judges have actually told me, I don't do internet. And, part of me the smartass in me wants to say, well, gee, when you were being sworn in, was that part of your oath that you will uphold the law except for the laws that make you involve technology that they're just too hard for you to figure out? So I obviously didn't say that because I want this judge to rule my motion. But the fact that you have judges who sometimes will say, I don't like this. And, that one judge transferred me to another judge. But I had another judge we were having a conference with my opposing counsel in front of me. She says, I don't like this internet stuff. What if I decide not to admit any of your evidence? What does that do to your case? Then she said, why don't you guys go back outside and see if you can settle it? So basically she said, why don't you go out and settle this case after I just told your opposing counsel that I'm going to throw out half your case.
Right, because it involved the internet.
And so that's a problem too. I mean, I think that's something that will be cured over time as, judges become more savvy technologically and just, by the as the people today who are online as kids become judges, that won't be as much an issue. But for now, it is a problem.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, that's with this massive of a shift. There's a generational gap, and there's still people. I mean, I'm middle age, but I know some younger people that are not as tech savvy, although they've just grown up with it. So to them, it's second nature, and I'm fortunate enough to have a mother who's 74 and online all the time, texting and all of that. Not everybody has that experience with their parents. And
no, I have a fond memory of showing email to my parents. And it was about 11 o'clock at night. I was sending an email to my sister. They're like, well, aren't you going to wake her up? And I'm like, no, it just sits in the inbox. And so, yeah.
But I think that's exactly what it is. Like you said, the judge that said, I don't do internet. I mean, maybe that's actually kind of safer if they don't fully understand what it's about.
It worked out well for me because he sent me to another judge. Actually, he sent me to another courthouse that was even closer to where I lived. So I'm like, great.
Perfect.
I don't have to drive as far in the morning. But so that worked out. But then I actually got signed to him again. And there's a process where you can disqualify judges, and I was just about to do it, and luckily he retired. But yeah, it is frustrating because I have to tell victims up front, okay, you call the police, but understand that they, some of them may, especially for revenge porn, there is a lot of victim blaming. They're like, girlfriend, don't take the picture.
Right.
And people
Why'd you let him film you?
Yeah. Well, sometimes they didn't know. I actually had a guest on my show. She was a news anchor in Pittsburgh, and she didn't know her boyfriend was, filming her in the shower and filming her in bed. And
that's kind of creepy.
So
I mean, those should just be personal violation cases, not even about where what the platform is. Like,
right.
The internet.
That's what it is. It's an invasion of privacy. And, we have deep-rooted, privacy is an important right in our country. Yeah. In California, it's even part of the Constitution. And so it's pretty deep-rooted. And so the notion that someone could violate you in that way, it is really, it goes to the core. And, with revenge porn, you may share an intimate image with someone you are in a relationship with. And, there's a lot of things you share in relationships. In fact, in the law, there's a privilege. You can't require a husband or a wife to testify against the other.
Yeah.
Because of the importance of the law wanting to allow people to, share their thoughts in marriage and not to have the law interfere with that. And it's the same thing here. And so, for some reason, because it involves nudity, we blame the victim and not the people who are perpetrating it.
Yeah,
that's not a point.
Well, and yes, you bring up a very valid point, like somebody not realizing that, and again, that's a complete privacy invasion there. But yeah, I'm always shocked, and in a lot of ways, things like Backpage and things of that nature that are shut down now, the savvy people will go to the dark web But I mean, a lot of people just expect that that's just a function of the internet now, right? Like you should be able to go on and buy drugs, find a prostitute, all of that. I run into that all the time. Like it is the Wild West. And,
You know,
and
it's funny. I interviewed a guy. He wrote a book called The Dark Web. I think it was called that. An Englishman who, to prove a point, he went out. He bought drugs through the dark web, which he said was for a friend, and then he actually he met a skinhead and hung out with him, and then he met these cam girls, and so the funny part, he was watching their session. And they make money by saying, "Hey, how much? If people bid X amount, I'll do this. Whatever kinky thing it is." And so they were running out of kinky things to do. They said, "Well, if you bid X amount, we'll bring this journalist on." And he's like, "No." And they got enough money, so they yanked him into the video. He said, "Yeah, I was a porn star for like 3 minutes," and
Wow.
but yeah, so there is the dark web, but as I mentioned, some of the sites have just moved offshore, so they're not in the U.S.
Yeah.
or subject to U.S. jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And like the one website that had that contest, but and at the same time, sex trafficking is a problem.
It is, and we were looking at some numbers on it, and realistically, as far as human trafficking goes, sex trafficking is about 8%. You had in the article.
Yeah, it's a pretty low number. I'll pull it up for the show notes.
But yeah, I mean,
the
FOSTA
trafficking
system
is in workers, right?
Exactly.
Domestic workers and agriculture, and that was one of the things I saw last May that someone put out, which is that there's this huge fuss around wanting to stop, and they don't say sex trafficking usually; they say human trafficking. And the bulk of human trafficking is the agricultural and domestic workers. And no one says, well, let's outlaw, domestic workers, or, let's make it impossible for people to find folks to
actually, it is. It's the 13th Amendment. We've outlawed slavery. Right. And that's what this is to an extent.
Right. But we don't outlaw like communication platform. And that's actually I think like anything, sex is usually kind of like, ooh, everybody wants to pay attention to it. But the actual like larger human rights violations are happening to these people who are being forced into servitude in the fields and in homes. And that's completely left out of this, human trafficking bill.
Because FOSTA SESTA didn't do anything for
even
it.
To extent, and not to jump into controversy, but we currently have this debate over immigration and people undocumented workers entering the U.S. and everyone's talking about we need to get them, whichever them people you don't like, out of the country, but no one talks about the people hiring them.
Yeah,
including our commander-in-chief.
Most recently. Well, and the reality is that there's a whole underground employment network around it that's about capitalism and saving money. And it's, and even in the recession in, was it 2008, they found that communities that had a huge immigration population tended to be more economically robust and to weather the recession with fewer ups and downs. So there's this huge, like you said, there's this weird controversy of like them, but then there's this whole other way in which we benefit from having immigrants, and which, there's employers who are hiring them. So maybe we need to look at it from a wider lens.
Which again, key point here, FOSTA SESTA did not do anything about that other 92%.
Yeah, nothing.
And I'm not saying that sex trafficking should be allowed.
There's an argument about whether it did anything about sex trafficking.
It sounds like it didn't.
Yeah.
It's unclear. So it's definitely made it harder, at least in U.S. platforms, and to the extent forcing people on the street. I think there have been evidence of sex workers being killed, suicides, more violence, increased. It's actually helped pimps. It's made them stronger, since they're a mechanism to deliver clients that Backpage had been.
Yeah. Yeah, it took a lot of the autonomy out of it. Now you're relying on somebody else who could be abusive or in some other way negatively impactful. So,
and I mean, a lot of people don't know how to access the back web, the dark web. Yes, there's a front web and there's a back web. No, and so Backpage probably was pretty easy. For someone who's not technologically sophisticated, you just type in an ad and boom, you're up there.
yeah.
And whereas doing a dark web isn't something everyone knows or is comfortable doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was fascinating to have you on. Definitely would love to have you back and cover some other topics as well.
Really appreciate you giving us your time.
Yeah.
Oh, happy to talk to you both. And congratulations on your first anniversary and best of luck with your show.
Thanks. Welcome to the Bi-Curian Moment.
So, it was a loaded show that we just did, and I really enjoyed having Bennet on, but it got me to thinking. We were actually talking off the air too, and I brought up Myanmar, and he had mentioned something about half the world is not currently connected on the internet, and I think in a lot of ways it's great initiative of the tech companies and Facebook and stuff like that, Google, to try to connect the world and all of that. It opens the door to so much information and knowledge sharing and all of that. That's what the internet was invented for. But it's also has a negative side effect. And in the case of Myanmar, if anyone's unfamiliar with that, it has become a platform, Facebook specifically, for organizing hate rallies against various different factions and cultural differences. I can't even claim to understand all of it. Like, I mean, I read it and it's the same as in any other part of the world when people hate the other people. I don't know why. It's history. It's things we don't get, right? And you really can break it down like, okay, these people are like those people. But the internet has been a double-edged sword in a country like Myanmar that basically got moved from third world country to connected overnight. And Facebook gave people phones essentially. Like they connected that place, they built the infrastructure, they had deals on phones that pretty much run Facebook almost as its core operating system. So and it was great that people could connect, and they did, and then they immediately started persecuting an entire group of people. So, to the point of where we're at with the internet, I really feel like we need to practice some responsibility and personal accountability. Like, this has to become a cultural thing.
Well, I remember, so there's the thing that Emily was saying on our episode, Something to Hide, we're talking about data and privacy. And she was saying that one of the challenges with the lack of privacy is that people begin to mimic what they see happening. Oh, that's normal. And I remember, my kids got along really well. They were super nice to each other, polite, shared everything until they were about like 8 and 9, maybe 7 and 8. And then we watched a movie, Freaky Friday maybe, where the brother and sister just really hated each other.
Mm.
And it was the first time that we'd actually watched a movie that had that particular trope in it. We didn't do a lot of movies, and the things that we did didn't necessarily have that trope. And they were fascinated by that dynamic. And that is when they began fighting. And they even used some of the words that the kids in the movie, the brother and sister in the movie, used to fight. And I was kind of horrified.
Yeah.
And there was this part of me that was like, well, maybe they had aggression that they weren't allowing out. And that let them know that they could, and they decided to copy that kind of aggression. Or maybe they thought brothers and sisters are supposed to act like that way, like it was just the right timing to kind of impress that on them. I don't really know, but it definitely affected them and how they behaved. And it took me a really long time to counter the effect of watching that one movie with them in terms of them taking on a different approach. And I just think of that when we're talking about this internet, the privacy and like what you're talking about, Facebook comes in, and what's happening on Facebook is all this like trolling, and I mean
there's trolling, there is the false news aspect,
and people mimic that.
Mm-hmm. And then they'll go ahead and make arguments around it.
Well,
so a premise that would never even had any basis in reality suddenly has a movement behind it.
Yeah.
And I mean, and we harp on it, I feel like, because we bring this kind of thing up a lot. But realistically, there is a level of responsibility that you have to have, no matter how strong your views are. And no matter how passionately you believe things in the incitement that some people engage in. And that's how, that's how this stuff spreads. And this is really core to what we do on the show here, is really try to get people to understand that actions have consequences. And even if you feel like you're right, there probably is a different side to the story that you should at least understand somebody might believe.
Right. There's always, it's that, I put it in the blog a couple weeks ago. It's one of my favorite philosophical tropes where there's, 5 people with blinders on touching an elephant. And each of them is very clear about what they're feeling, rough skin, or a hard, pointy, smooth tusk or tail. And they each assert, like, this is what an elephant is.
Yeah.
And the reality is they're all right.
Right.
They're all actually accurately describing their experience. And if they could take the blinders off and step back, they'd see the elephant is all of the things.
Yeah.
And so, while I'm not saying there aren't times when you have to oppose something, I do think that keeping the mental flexibility of saying, I might have blinders on, this person who's talking in a way that sounds nutty to me might be touching the tusk. So let me just step back and try to understand what's happening for them before I decide to condemn them, their thinking. Like, maybe there's a point in there. So
yeah, it's about responsible opposition.
Responsible opposition. Oh, I like that phrase. Did you just make that up?
I did.
Oh, I like it. We're going to coin that phrase. Just you wait. Next year it's going to be viral. Responsible opposition. Well, I'll do a quick. Mostly, I've been thinking about sort of that tension between liberty and, I guess, security, right? Like one of those founding principles that we talk about.
Yeah.
In terms of the internet, and in this particular way, I actually have more the conservative leaning. I tend to lean towards allowing liberty and encouraging accountability over more legislation, and in terms of this sort of the security aspect. And it's funny because I know that when I've had those conversations with people, of course the counter to the liberty argument is, well, what about the people who are suffering because of this freedom that allows for that? Well, I think it's horrible. I think we need to oppose the suffering. And I also just feel like there's a lot of really reactive laws and legislative things that have unintended consequences. And those are also harmful. Those are differently harmful than the harm that we see. And while I, like many people, can get incredibly frustrated by the glacial, slow way in which our system of laws and government moves forward to address issues, there's a protection in that, because it also does, when it is going slowly, there's less likely to be things that have those very harmful, unintended consequences, either to people in terms of their suffering or in terms of our culture and our overall respect or freedoms or educational process. So that's the Bicurian moment for me. Is it's been really thinking about like where those two tensions meet, and a little bit why I land more on the freedom side.
Yeah. Well, there is a such thing as feel-good legislation. in general, it never quite works out the way I think people hope. And that's just the reality, that when you do something because you think we need to do this huge sweeping thing and shut this thing down, there are always consequences. There's always another side to that story. And so, again, to that point, there's how about a responsibility of people as individuals
Yeah.
in how they present.
Yeah.
So
That's what I got. So thanks for listening. We very much hope you will join our mailing list. It's a brand new addition to our program. It's at bit.ly/bicure, BICUR. And then you can get episodes and blogs conveniently emailed directly to you. Learn more about us at bicurian.com/podcast.
And of course, if you like what we are doing, please rate us on your listening platform of choice.
Thank you.